On the evening of June 20th, 1978, rock and roll music blasted from inside a little white house on Acton Avenue in the suburb of Wood River, Illinois. Inside the house, 22-year-old Carla Brown set 4 pizzas down on a pile of milk crates that for that night served as her dining room table. The petite blonde woman was exhausted from hauling boxes and furniture all day, but she wanted to thank the friends who had helped move her and her fiancé into their new home, so she was hosting a house party. Carla's best friend, Debbie, raised her beer into the air and said that hopefully this house would soon be filled with the pitter-patter of little feet running around. Carla, who was looking forward to getting pregnant, beamed and looked over at her fiancé, Mark Hart. Mark was laughing, but he had his hands up in front of his face as if to say, slow down here. He joked that before they had kids, he'd just like to get their boxes unpacked first. Carla had been dating Mark, the 27-year-old apprentice electrician, since he returned from the war in Vietnam. Carla was totally crazy about him, but their 5-year courtship had been anything but smooth. Mark was one of the few men in Carla's life who had not immediately thrown himself at her feet and done whatever it took to make her happy. At 4'11" tall, Carla was shorter than most girls in Wood River, but that hadn't stopped her from becoming a varsity cheerleader in high school. She was kind and approachable, which made her popular with boys and girls alike, and she was curvy enough to attract wolf whistles from total strangers out on the street. But Mark was different. She had to chase him, because Mark was one of those guys who started sweating at the thought of commitment. He had broken things off with Carla more than once before when the pressure to settle down just got to him. But he always came back. And now, finally, the couple was not only engaged to be married, but they also had just bought a house together. Carla sipped her beer and thought to herself how much she wished her father could see how far she had come. Ever since he died in an accident when she was just 11 years old, Carla had been looking for a real home. She and her mom had fought so much that Carla moved out as a teenager. She lived with her best friend Debbie and other friends, bouncing from place to place, until now. It was barely 1,000 square feet of living space, but to Carla, this new home for her and Mark was a dream house. A loud knock on the front door suddenly brought Carla's focus back to the party. Carla got up and walked over to the door, and she opened it up. And standing outside was a shaggy-looking guy in his early 20s named Lee Barnes. Carla had seen Lee while she and Mark were moving in earlier that day. Lee had been drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana with 2 other guys at the house next door. One of them had made a lewd remark about Carla's breasts, but then Lee called out to her by name and said they went to high school together, though she only vaguely remembered him. Carla mustered a good-natured hello, but quickly just went back to unpacking. And now that guy, Lee, was standing on her porch, asking to join the party along with his 2 buds, Paul Maines and John Prant. Lee told Carla that they had marijuana they would share if they would share that pizza with him and his friends. He said, "Come on, it'll be fun." But Carla had no desire to invite this trio into her home. This was a special night for Carla, and she only wanted to share it with people closest to her. So she told Lee that she was tired, and they were about to wrap things up anyways, and so maybe they could hang out another time. Lee looked mildly annoyed at the rejection, but he took the hint and left, with his pals trailing right behind him. Carla shut the front door and then put another Blondie album on the record player. Soon all the girls were dancing, and Carla was swaying right along with the beat. And as she did, she looked over at Mark. And Mark gazed back at her as if she was the only woman in the world. The next day, Carla took the day off from her job in customer service at an airplane parts company. She had way too much to do getting settled into her new home, including cleaning up the trash from the party the night before. But so far, on this kind of unexpected day off, she'd spent most of the morning on the phone. At 9, she called her best friend Debbie, who was home with her baby. And then after she hung up with Debbie, Mark's mother called her, and she really liked to talk. Carla glanced at the clock. It was already 11 a.m., and Mark's mom showed no sign of slowing down. Carla was starting to feel guilty that she was getting so little done with this day off. While Mark was hard at work, Carla was supposed to be organizing their house. So eventually, Carla made up a lie that she had just heard someone knock at her front door, and so she needed to go, and so Mark's mother took the hint, and they hung up. And so now that Carla was finally free, she just headed downstairs to the finished basement where the couple had left their unpacked boxes, and Carla got back to work. But minutes later, Carla was unpacking a 10-gallon barrel labeled Mark that contained his clothes when she heard footsteps coming down the stairs to the basement. Figuring that Mark must have forgotten something before he left for work, Carla stopped what she was doing and she turned around with a big smile on her face, ready to greet her husband. A little after 5 o'clock that evening, Carla's husband, Mark, pulled up to the house in a pickup truck driven by his friend Tom. They were hauling a large doghouse behind them. Mark knew how much Carla loved his parents' golden retriever dog, so he planned to get a dog for her as soon as they were settled in. Mark told Tom that he kind of secretly hoped that Carla would love this puppy so much that she might wait on having a kid right away. Once the pickup truck came to a stop, Mark slid out of the passenger seat and walked up the front path to his one-story clapboard house and went in the front door. He expected to find Carla, but didn't see her in the living room, and she didn't answer when he called her name. Mark picked up an empty beer can from the night before and took it into the kitchen. As he threw it into the trash can, he noticed that the back door was ajar. He felt annoyed with Carla for leaving it open because all sorts of insects could get in. He shut the door, then joined his friend Tom outside. They carried the doghouse to the backyard and set it down under the shade of an oak tree. Then Mark invited his friend inside for a tour of their new house. He showed Tom their bedroom and the spare room that Carla was already calling the baby's room, and then Mark asked Tom if he wanted to go downstairs and see his favorite part of the house, the basement. Tom said, yeah, let's do it. So Mark led the way down the steps to the basement, where he had set up the TV and a sofa. No matter what was going on upstairs, he told Tom as they walked down, we can always watch football in peace down here. But when they actually got downstairs, Mark immediately noticed something strange. The sofa appeared to be soaking wet, and the TV tray in front of it was turned upside down. Beside the sofa were several dark red drops on the basement floor, and Mark wondered if maybe it was blood. And so in a second, his mood switched from being annoyed to being very anxious. Mark looked rapidly around the room for some explanation for what was going on, but everything else seemed totally normal. Then Mark turned toward these swinging doors that led to the laundry room, and in the gap between the bottom of the doors and the floor, he could see Carla's bare legs. Suddenly panicking, Mark screamed out Carla's name, but Carla didn't answer. And so Mark ran into the laundry room, and what he saw in there was worse than anything he saw in Vietnam. Carla was kneeling on the ground with her hands tied behind her back, and her head was submerged in a 10-gallon barrel full of water. Carla was also naked from the waist down. Mark ran over to the barrel and saw bubbles in the water around Carla's head, and for just a second he thought maybe he could save her. But when he frantically pulled her head out of the water, he saw her complexion was already gray, and she had 2 long gashes across her forehead, as well as serious bruising under her chin. Also, 2 of Mark's socks were tied tightly around Carla's neck, digging into her skin. Mark checked her wrist for a pulse, but couldn't find one. And so as Mark cradled his fiancée in his lap and began to cry, Tom raced upstairs and called 911. The first police officer arrived at the house just before 6 p.m. His name was Don Greer, and he was a 27-year-old from the Wood River Police. And he actually knew Mark. They were old friends who used to go out on double dates together. When Greer heard the 911 report of a deceased woman at Mark Hart's new address, his heart sank. He hoped it was a mistake. When Greer arrived at the house, he would find Mark sitting at the kitchen table, staring ahead with glassy eyes. Mark looked up and seemed to recognize his old friend, but all he could say was, "She's down in the basement." Greer went directly down the stairs to where Mark and Tom had laid a red blanket over Carla, who was now face down on the floor. When Greer looked beneath the blanket, he was shocked by the brutality of the murder. It looked like Carla had been beaten as well as strangled, and probably raped too. But he had been told that her head was underwater when she was found, so maybe she had drowned. But it certainly wasn't easy to determine just from looking at her what killed Carla. There were just too many possibilities. Wood River was just across the Mississippi River from the city of St. Louis, so big city crime did show up in this town periodically. But murders were rare, and usually they were just the result of a bar fight or some other physical altercation. Greer had never seen a homicide in Wood River that was this violent and perverse. In fact, no one in the Wood River police force had. And for Greer, this was not just any murder victim. It was his friend's fiancée. Greer could scarcely concentrate on sizing up the crime scene. He felt like he should run upstairs to comfort his friend after such a horrible loss. But Greer couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't come off phony. So Greer settled for going upstairs and laying his hand on Mark's shoulder before asking Mark and Tom to please tell him exactly what happened. Mark began talking about how excited he was to show Carla this new doghouse, but as he spoke, Greer could only think about the nightmare in the basement. The Wood River police were going to need help to solve this murder. A few hours later, at around 8 p.m., crime scene technician Alva Bush of the Illinois State Police pulled up to the house on Acton Ave. Greer didn't know him personally, but Bush was the first guy the chief had wanted to call when Greer told him they needed a high-level crime scene analyst. Bush, who was a Vietnam veteran and former narcotics officer, was built like a bear and was known to speak bluntly. But at only 30 years old, he was already the most perceptive and intuitive crime scene tech in the state. Bush walked into the kitchen and introduced himself to Mark, who was clutching a framed photograph of Carla. Bush looked closely at her smiling face as Mark tearfully recounted how he had found his fiancée in the basement. Bush then headed to the basement with Greer, glad that he saw Carla in life before he saw her as a murder victim. Bush's first reaction when he reached the crime scene was irritation. Mark and Tom, in their desperation to save Carla, had moved her body to the floor and away from the barrel of water where they found it. It always made Bush's work harder when someone tampered with the crime scene before he arrived. Clues were almost always lost. Nonetheless, he quickly started forming a mental picture of the crime that had unfolded right here. Greer removed the blanket to show Carla's body to Bush, and it didn't take a genius to suspect sexual assault. Carla was nude from the waist down. Bush examined the wounds on Carla's face. The cuts ran parallel across her forehead, bloody but too shallow to be fatal. He wondered what would make a wound like that. The socks tied around Carla's neck made it look like she had been strangled with them, but Bush thought the knots were too neat to have caused her death. A death struggle is messy business, and these socks looked more like a decorative scarf than a murder weapon. Bush told Greer that the killer very likely tied these socks around her neck after she was already dead. Bush also doubted that Carla had drowned. The water inside the 10-gallon barrel where Carla's head was submerged had only the slightest tinge of red, even though Carla had fresh bleeding wounds on her face. That told Bush that she was most likely already dead when the killer dunked her head inside of the water. And the more Bush looked around, the more he became convinced that the killer must have deliberately rearranged the entire crime scene before they fled. The brightly colored wool sweater Carla was still wearing was just too neat. The single button near the neckline was still fastened, which seemed really unlikely to Bush considering there must have been a life-and-death struggle. Also, it seemed unlikely that Carla would be wearing a sweater at all on a warm June day. And so Bush figured the killer must have dressed Carla in the sweater after they killed her. Likewise, Bush thought the cords wrapped around Carla's wrists were added for show as well. The bonds were so loose that there was just no way that could have kept Carla's hands bound, especially, again, in the middle of a life-and-death struggle. Bush concluded that the killer very likely assaulted Carla while she was on the couch, and then bashed her in the head with something, and then strangled her as she bled. Afterwards, the killer very likely tried to wash the blood off the couch, which is why the cushions looked soaked, and then, very likely, the killer dragged Carla's body to the laundry room, where he dressed her in the sweater, tied the socks around her neck, and then stuck her head in the water to make it look like she had drowned. And then, just before the killer left, they very likely took Carla's panties as some kind of sick trophy. But as Bush thought about this, he also thought to himself, why would this killer have gone to all this trouble to stage the crime scene? I mean, that would require the killer to stick around the murder scene for a long period of time, making it more and more likely they would get caught. Bush could see that the killer clearly thought it was important to try to confuse the investigators, but Bush also wondered if maybe the murderer was also just trying to send some kind of chilling message. The murder scene reminded Bush of the work of the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy, who raped and murdered dozens of young women. But Bundy had been arrested a few months earlier, so it couldn't have been him. However, Bush wondered if maybe they had a new serial killer on their hands that might have been inspired by Ted Bundy. Police quickly determined that the last person to speak with Carla had been Mark's mother, and she would say they were on the phone right up until about 11 that morning. So, using that as a frame of reference, police began going door to door asking neighbors about what they might have heard or seen that day between 11 a.m., when we know Carla was still alive, and 5 p.m., when Mark came home and found Carla dead. Greer knocked on the door of the house next to Carla and Mark's, where those three guys had been smoking pot and drinking beer and calling out lewd remarks to Carla before going over to Carla's house and trying to go to her party. And so the door opened, but there was a screen that separated Greer from a skinny 22-year-old Paul Main who was standing inside. Greer asked Paul if he could come inside and speak with him, and Paul immediately looked super nervous and taken aback, and Greer had an idea why. He could smell the pot smoke from where he was standing. Greer promised Paul that he was not there to try to bust him for marijuana. It was fine. Paul nodded and opened the screen door. Greer stepped inside the house. The walls were totally bare, other than a few rock posters, and the furniture looked really old and ragged. Greer sat down across from Paul at a card table and then asked him what he'd been up to until 5 p.m. that day. Paul said he was home for most of it. He said he was alone until noon, when his friend John Prant came over to hang out until about 3, when Paul had to go run some errands. But Paul said he didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. He said Carla and Mark had only moved in the day before, so he scarcely knew them. Paul said that his friend Lee knew Carla from high school, and they had gone over to greet the newcomers the night before, but Carla and her boyfriend did not seem very interested in socializing with them, so they had left. And so that was the last time Paul said he saw Carla. As for Paul's friends, Lee and John, they were no more help when Greer tracked them down. Lee wasn't even in the neighborhood on the day of the murder, and John told Greer that he was in the neighborhood. He was at Paul's place twice that day, first early in the morning when he was out delivering job applications, and then from noon to about 3, he was back at Paul's place when he was just hanging out. And just like Paul, John said he did not see anything out of the ordinary. And that's how it went with all the potential witnesses. Greer went door after door, but no one had heard or seen anything unusual on Acton Ave that day. Somehow the killer had violently assaulted and killed Carla Brown without anybody noticing. Autopsy results the next day confirmed just how violent Carla's final moments had been. She had a broken jaw and deep bruises all over her neck, in addition to the cuts on her forehead. She also had bits of skin underneath her fingernails, likely from scratching her assailant's face and back. But unfortunately, in the 1970s, DNA analysis was not an option. What the coroner did not find was significant water in Carla's lungs, which he would have expected with a drowning. Bush had been right. She did not drown at all. The coroner ruled that she had died from strangulation, likely by a cable or the killer's bare hands, before she was placed in that barrel of water. Now, the investigators were sure the killer had staged the crime scene. All across Wood River that day, June 22nd, people woke up to front-page news about the shocking murder of Carla Brown, along with a picture of Carla from her senior yearbook. The article described the crime as being potentially a sexual murder, possibly tied to a recent string of incidents in the community. Over the past 15 months, a man had attacked 14 women in their homes, and he was still at large. But Bush told the Wood River police that he didn't buy that theory. That serial rapist who was attacking women in their homes always broke in at night, but Carla was killed in the middle of the day, and the serial rapist did not kill his victims. But there were enough obvious similarities between those attacks and the attack on Carla that Bush knew he couldn't totally rule out the serial rapist theory. In fact, Bush and the Wood River police were having a hard time ruling out anyone as a suspect, from strangers to her fiancé. They believed that the murder was a sex crime, but they had very few clues as to who did it. Greer knew that the first suspect in all these kinds of cases is the domestic partner, but Greer felt like his old friend Mark was a very unlikely murderer. Not only was he clearly distraught at his fiancé's death, but Mark's boss confirmed to Greer that he had been working at a job site all day. And so Greer told the chief that they should focus on other possibilities. Greer spent a big part of June 22nd talking to all 10 guests who had gone to Carla and Mark's house party, but most of them couldn't imagine who would want to hurt someone as nice as Carla. One guy told Greer that Carla was really good at saying the right thing when people felt down. This guy was very self-conscious about the fact that he was quite short, but Carla, who was several inches shorter than him, once told him that he was tall to her. Greer was starting to think that he was not going to get any useful information from these 10 people, but when he sat down with the last person, Carla's best friend Debbie, she would identify 2 potential suspects that in theory could have wanted to do harm to Carla. The first suspect was an ex-boyfriend in Connecticut that Carla dated over a year ago during one of her breakups with Mark. The guy took it really hard when Carla broke it off to return to Mark, and he kept getting in touch with Carla for months. Debbie couldn't remember his name, though. Debbie also fingered Carla's stepfather, a heavy drinker with a temper. She said that when she and Carla were seniors in high school, Carla's stepfather tried to force himself on Carla. Afterwards, Carla excused his behavior, saying he was drunk, but drunk or not, Debbie called it attempted rape. Carla's mother eventually had the marriage annulled. Both of these suspects that Debbie brought up were intriguing possibilities, but Greer quickly got information that scratched both of them from his list of suspects. The ex-boyfriend was in New Jersey on business on the day of the murder, while Carla's stepfather said that he and Carla had remained close, and he had recently even given her money for dental work, and he also easily passed a lie detector test to prove he never assaulted Carla and had nothing to do with Carla's death. By the day of Carla's funeral, which was Saturday, June 24th, investigators were getting frustrated at their lack of progress. 3 days after the crime, and they still had no strong suspect. At 1 p.m., Woodland Hill Cemetery filled up with residents from Wood River who gathered to say goodbye to Carla. So many of them had brought flowers that the local shop had to stop taking orders. 6 pallbearers carried Carla's casket from the hearse to the gravesite. Mark had chosen all former boyfriends of Carla's who had remained friends with her. Greer watched the crowd, looking for anything unusual, but all he saw was a community in pain. He felt so much pressure to bring justice to these people and to bring it fast. But the investigation seemed to just be going backwards. In fact, the lab had just called to say that every fingerprint they had found in the basement was either Carla's or Mark's, so the killer didn't even leave behind any prints. Greer watched as Carla's casket was lowered into the ground, and he thought to himself, this can't be the end of the story. 5 days after the murder, the Illinois State Police sent a detective named Randy Rushing to take a fresh look at the evidence. The muscular former state trooper with the handlebar mustache had taught criminal law at the police academy before joining the Department of Criminal Investigations. Now, he was supposed to give the case a top-to-bottom review to see if there was something the local police had missed. And Rushing was interested in the potheads next door to Carla and Mark, noting that Paul and John had given slightly different accounts of where they'd been the day of the murder. John had said he had visited Paul around 8:30 a.m., while Paul didn't remember seeing John until noon. Detective Rushing wondered if they were hiding something. But once again, the theory went nowhere. John passed a polygraph test easily, and Paul, he did fail part of the test, but the test administrator thought that it might have to do with him being nervous, or maybe he was high, or both. In fact, Paul was slurring his words during the test. And so Rushing and the test administrator both agreed that the polygraph tests gave them very little to work with. But they planned to keep their eye on Paul Maines because technically he did fail the polygraph. For a brief moment in late July, so about a month after the killing, investigators got excited when Wood River police arrested a 21-year-old man named Tony Garza for breaking into a woman's house and trying to rape her. Garza actually confessed to the 14 break-ins and sexual assaults that had occurred in town over the previous 15 months. But Garza was adamant that he had nothing to do with Carla Brown's death, and he too passed a polygraph test. Detective Rushing still had his suspicions about Garza. A violent assault could easily turn into a murder after all, but he had no evidence connecting the alleged rapist to Carla Brown. No fingerprints, no witnesses. So investigators kept Garza on their list of suspects, even though they knew it didn't mean much. They had no more evidence against Garza than they did for several other potential suspects, including that next-door neighbor, Paul Maines, who failed a portion of his polygraph. Rushing, Greer, and the rest of the investigators knew they needed a break in the case or no one would be held accountable for Carla's murder. And by the fall of 1978, with no main suspect in sight, state police finally pulled Rushing off the case. Greer kept the case open, but as months and even years passed by with no new leads, he worried that Carla Brown's murder might never be solved. By June of 1980, so 2 years after the murder, the investigation was in the deep freeze, and Carla's fiancé, Mark, had given up hope that her killer would ever be brought to justice. Bush, the crime scene analyst, had worked on literally hundreds of other criminal cases since the murder of Carla Brown. But he never forgot Carla's smiling face in the photo that Mark was holding that day, or the terrible injuries she had suffered at the hands of her killer. And the idea that her killer was getting away with murder really gnawed at Bush. At the time, Bush was in New Mexico to testify at another trial when he attended a police seminar on a new investigative technique called computer image enhancement. He sat on the edge of his seat in a university lecture hall as a forensic dentist, Dr. Homer Campbell, explained how the computer could transform a two-dimensional photograph into a three-dimensional image, giving police new insights into crime scenes. Dr. Campbell demonstrated how this technique enabled investigators to scour a picture in a much deeper way, picking up details that were previously invisible. After the lecture ended, Bush walked right up to Campbell and said, "Hey, I have a case for you." He explained that Carla Brown's murder had baffled investigators, in part because the killer had completely rearranged the crime scene, making it hard for them to find real clues. He said investigators were particularly puzzled by two parallel cuts on Carla's forehead. Campbell was intrigued. So the next day, Bush sent over the crime scene photos from Carla's murder, and Dr. Campbell ran them through his computer enhancement process, and then afterwards he asked Bush if he could take a look at the TV tray that was found next to Carla's sofa that was visible in the pictures. When Campbell had zoomed in really tightly on the tray, he discovered a strand of Carla's blonde hair and some of her blood. Instantly, Campbell realized that whoever Carla's killer was had struck her with the TV tray. That's where those cuts had come from on Carla's head. Then Dr. Campbell asked Bush about the bite mark. Bush froze. He was not aware of any bite mark on Carla. He had focused on the heavy bruising around Carla's neck from the strangulation and ignored what looked like a relatively minor bruising around her collarbone. But studying the enhanced photograph, Dr. Campbell found the telltale marks left by a set of teeth. Bush initially blamed himself. How could he have missed a bite mark on the body? But Dr. Campbell assured him that without the enhancement, no one would have caught it. Now the question was, could this be used to identify the killer? Dr. Campbell believed that a bite mark was almost as good as a fingerprint. In fact, it was Dr. Campbell's testimony about a bite mark in the Ted Bundy murder trial 2 years earlier that helped convict Ted Bundy. With Campbell's big discovery, they could now compare suspects' teeth against the shape of the bite mark on Carla. Without a court order, it would not be easy to get suspects to agree to have molds made of their teeth, but Bush had a plan to get what they needed. And he called Rushing, the state police detective, to help. Of all the people investigators had spoken to, Carla's next-door neighbor, Paul, the guy who had partially failed the polygraph, was still at the top of their list of suspects. And even without a mold of his teeth, they could tell that Campbell's bite mark analysis suggested he could be their guy. Whoever killed Carla had crooked teeth, and just from looking at Paul, he also clearly had crooked teeth. But by this time, September of 1980, so 2 years and 3 months after Carla's murder, Paul no longer lived on Acton Avenue. But Wood River police officer Don Greer, who by this point had been promoted to deputy chief, tracked Paul down at a YMCA about 15 minutes away, and he gave him a call. Greer lied and told Paul that he was calling from an insurance company that had a check for him, money he was owed from an accident a few years back. Now, this was a deliberate deception, one that would likely be tossed out by a court as unethical today, but back in 1978, it worked like a charm. Paul came right to the closed insurance company building that police were using as their front, and he presented himself at the front desk, ready to receive his check, but very quickly, Paul realized he had walked into a trap. Paul looked even thinner than when Greer had questioned him 2 years earlier. Rushing noticed that Paul was trembling and thought there was a good chance he would crack and give a confession. But Paul stuck to his original story when he was asked. He said he had no idea who killed Carla. But Greer and Rushing did not believe him, and they made that very clear to him. They said there was only one way he could prove his innocence. Let them take an impression of his teeth to compare against the killer's teeth. And Paul agreed. They overnighted the impression of Paul's teeth to Dr. Campbell, and then all the investigators held their breath until they heard back the next day. Finally, 27 months after the crime, they hoped they were on the brink of justice for Carla. But when Dr. Campbell called, he had disappointing news. The forensic dentist told them that the photographs, even with the computer enhancements, were not good enough to declare Paul's bite as a match. Paul could be the killer, but Campbell was not certain. Rushing, Greer, and Bush alike were crushed. The Carla Brown case was cold again. And it would stay that way for 2 more years, until one chilly day in March of 1982, when Detective Rushing met an FBI agent who would go on to help break the case wide open with absolutely stunning psychological insights into the mind of their killer. Rushing was at a conference in St. Louis when he attended a session led by Agent John Douglas, who was a pioneer in the art of profiling suspects so that police knew who to look for. Douglas's 6-person team specialized in creating psychological profiles of serial killers. The tall, slender agent wearing a vest and tie talked about traveling the country to speak with killers like Charles Manson and others less famous but no less deadly to understand how their minds worked. Rushing was totally mesmerized by Douglas's way of analyzing killers' motives and weaknesses. And so Rushing couldn't help but wonder, what kind of suspect would Douglas profile if he looked at the Carla Brown case? And so after the talk was over, Rushing approached Douglas and asked for his help. And Douglas agreed. 6 weeks later, Bush and Rushing piled into an unmarked police car to make the 800-mile drive to FBI headquarters in Virginia to go over the case with John Douglas. Greer, who was now Wood River's chief of police, flew back from a vacation in Florida to join them on this trip. When the investigators arrived at the sprawling FBI campus, an agent from Douglas's behavioral science unit escorted them to a conference room. They spread pictures from the crime scene across the table. Then Douglas breezed into the room, shook hands, and started examining the photos. A few minutes later, he sat back in his chair, assembling the details he had just formed in his head, and then he launched into a highly specific description of the killer that was so precise it was like he actually knew him and was there in the basement 4 years earlier when the crime happened on June 20th, 1978. He said the crime scene looked disorderly, which made him think the killer was a shaggy-looking, disorderly person. Someone with low self-esteem who was awkward with women and had a history of rejection. Douglas then said the killer likely drove a beat-up old car, something like a red or orange Volkswagen. Now, to Bush, Rushing, and Greer, it almost seemed like Douglas was just making things up as he went along. And so as Douglas spoke, they began exchanging doubtful looks and wondered if they drove all this way for nothing. But Douglas wasn't done. He said it was common for killers to keep something from their victims. And when he said this, Bush looked knowingly at Greer, because 4 years ago, they had discussed the fact that Carla's panties were missing from the crime scene, and maybe they had been taken as a trophy. Douglas then said that the Carla Brown murder scene had some of the trappings of a serial killer, especially the way the killer had moved things around to create the appearance that Carla had drowned in that 10-gallon barrel. But Douglas said the killer had never killed anyone before Carla, and the killer probably did not come over to Carla's house to kill her. This surprised the investigators, and so Rushing asked Douglas how he could possibly know that. And Douglas just pointed to the photograph showing the soaking wet sofa, and he said, well, it looks like the perp tried to revive his victim by splashing water on her. That does not seem like a killer who just goes around killing people. This seems like maybe it happened by accident. Bush's jaw dropped. The wet sofa had perplexed him and all of his investigators for 4 years. Douglas said the strangulation and blows to the face indicated a personal confrontation. Maybe Carla rejected him sexually and he struck back. In cases like that, Douglas said, the killer usually faces the victim and attacks the face and neck. Douglas would go on and describe this case as what he called a neighborhood crime, meaning it was likely committed by someone living nearby or literally in the victim's household. Douglas looked at the 3 men and told them that very likely they had already interviewed the killer. Rushing piped up and said, well, what would happen if the killer took a polygraph? Douglas shook his head, uncertain. He felt the polygraph was not a reliable tool. He'd seen too many cases where the killer beat the test, but was convicted on other evidence. Greer wondered what that meant for their case. All of their potential suspects had passed their polygraph, except for Paul, who had failed a portion of it. Then Douglas looked at the photograph of the blood droplets from the crime scene again, and he said the killer must have had blood on him, and so after Carla was dead, the killer must have gone somewhere nearby to try to clean himself up. And when Greer heard that, he thought, well, if the killer was Paul, how much closer than next door can you get? Because Paul lived next door to Carla. Bush, Greer, and Rushing were already blown away by Douglas's insights. But then the FBI agent leaned across the table and delivered the best news of all. Since their killer was almost certainly an amateur killer, he would easily crack under pressure. Douglas suggested that the police should mount a psychological warfare campaign in the media. He said that they should play up ways that emerging technology has helped them gather evidence, how the photo enhancement led to the discovery of the bite mark, and how psychological profiling enabled them to narrow down their suspect list. Basically, Douglas was telling them to use the media to try to trick the killer into thinking that their arrest was imminent. Then Bush brought up the idea of digging up Carla's body. Dr. Campbell had suggested that the casket, if it kept the water out as it was designed to, could preserve the body for some time. Whatever bruising occurred would still be present in the skin. They could get a better look at the bite mark on her neck and match it to suspect's teeth, Bush noted. Douglas said spreading the news that police were about to exhume Carla's body would be the perfect way to destabilize their target. The killer, Douglas believed, had visited Carla's grave many times to talk to her. She was likely the only person who knew his terrible secret. After 4 years, Douglas thought their killer must have gotten comfortable, believing that he'd gotten away with his crime. Digging up Carla's body would resurrect his fear of getting caught, and that could lead to a major mistake, if not a confession. Bush, Rushing, and Greer left the meeting feeling totally floored. John Douglas looked at the case that had stumped them for years, and in a matter of minutes created a psychological profile for the man who had killed Carla, and a roadmap that could lead police to him. As they drove back to Illinois, they went over their list of suspects and knew there were still several men who fit Douglas's description of the killer, including the serial rapist and Paul, the next-door neighbor. The 3 investigators met with the district attorney as soon as they got back to Madison County, Illinois, and the DA immediately agreed to the FBI profiler's media strategy. Over the next 2 weeks, the district attorney held a series of press conferences doling out information about the re-energized Carla Brown investigation. He played up the fact that the guy who had helped nab serial killer Ted Bundy was advising investigators. And soon, stories about the Carla Brown investigation became a regular feature in the regional newspaper for days and days. Amid the media frenzy, police received a call from a friend of Carla's next-door neighbor. 2 days after the murder, this friend hosted a party that Paul attended. He said that Paul mentioned that police had been around his place asking questions and that he might have to leave town if the heat turned up on him. The friend explained that he had kept his mouth shut about what he overheard Paul saying for almost 4 years, but he was now finally moved to call the police after he had heard the district attorney talk about the bite mark on Carla's collarbone. The friend said that back when the murder first happened, Paul had actually talked about how the killer had bit Carla. Now, this friend was starting to think that Paul might know more about the crime than he was admitting to. That got Rushing's attention. No one knew about the bite mark until Dr. Campbell discovered it in a computer-enhanced photo 2 years after the murder. Well, no one knew about it prior to that, except for the killer. On June 1st, 1982, almost 4 years after the murder, reporters from all over the St. Louis region gathered around Carla Brown's grave at the Woodlawn Cemetery. They snapped pictures of her headstone, which read, "So lovely, so loving, so loved." As the backhoe dug into the ground, Chief Greer stood shoulder to shoulder with Rushing and Bush, praying that this invasion of Carla's grave would lead them to her killer. The casket was lifted out of the ground and placed into a hearse and driven to the St. Louis Medical Examiner's office. Greer, Bush, and Rushing gathered around the casket as the coroner opened it up. The casket had been sealed well, leaving the body in very good condition. The skin had not deteriorated very much, and this time, Bush zeroed in with his camera on the bite mark. Using new high-resolution film, he snapped photograph after photograph. Now armed with much better images of this bite mark, investigators wanted to compare them with Paul's dental impression. Bush, Rushing, and Greer flew out to New York to meet with a bite mark expert. He was going to match the teeth marks on Carla's collarbone against impressions taken from several men they had spoken to over the last several years, including Paul from next door and Carla's ex-stepfather. Now, none of these bite molds were labeled by name, so this expert had no idea whose teeth were which as he did the comparison. Sitting at his kitchen table on Long Island, New York, the bite mark expert performed a blind comparison, and sure enough, he found a perfect match. Investigators now knew who killed Carla, and unbelievably, the real killer basically lined up perfectly with the profile of the killer they had gotten from Douglas. Based on all the forensic evidence and other evidence collected at the crime scene, here is what investigators believe happened to Carla on January 21st, 1978. Around 11 a.m. on that day, the killer parked his beat-up red Volkswagen vehicle at a laundromat about a block from Carla and Mark's house. As he walked from his car towards their house, he reached back and he touched his back pocket to make sure the coil of electrical cord was still there, and it was. The killer entered the house through the back door, which was unlocked. He then headed right downstairs to the basement to confront Carla. Carla recognized him and demanded to know what he was doing there, but the killer didn't explain himself. Instead, he just grabbed her and forced her onto the sofa. Carla fought back as hard as she could, but her killer was much stronger and twice her weight. The killer then kissed Carla on the face and the neck, and then bit her along the collarbone. Then he pulled off Carla's shorts, pinned her to the couch, and unzipped his jeans. It was at this point that Carla apparently screamed an insult at him, and that's when the killer snapped. Years of rejection just overtook him, triggered by Carla's taunting. He grabbed the TV tray near him and swung it as hard as he could into Carla's face, breaking her jaw. Then the killer lifted that tray back into the air and brought it down again on Carla's face, leaving that parallel gash in Carla's forehead. As Carla reeled from these blows, the killer pulled out that electrical cord from his back pocket and tied it tight around Carla's neck. And the killer pulled as tight as he could on that cord, constricting Carla's windpipe until her face turned beet red. The pressure closed off her carotid artery, depriving her brain of oxygen, and so in seconds, Carla lost consciousness. A A few seconds later, the killer released the wire and sat up, and as he caught his breath, he looked around wildly, wondering what was going on, as if he'd just woken up from a nightmare. And then he looked at Carla, and he saw her lying lifeless on the sofa. Suddenly realizing what he'd just done, he panicked. He pulled the wire completely off Carla's neck, he slapped her face a few times to try to revive her, but when that didn't work, he drew some water from the sink and poured it on Carla's face, and when that failed, the killer decided to just rearrange the entire crime scene, hoping to throw off the police. Inspired by recent accounts of Ted Bundy, the killer staged Carla's body to make it look like the work of a serial killer. Then the killer wiped down all the surfaces he touched, ran up the stairs, and slipped out the back door. Then he snuck over to the house right next door and washed Carla's blood off himself before anyone realized he was there. At 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday, June 8, 1982, just days before the 4th anniversary of Carla's murder, Greer and Rushing arrested the killer at his parents' home. All these years, they had been so focused on Carla's neighbor, Paul, because he seemed suspicious and he had failed his polygraph, when the whole time, the real murderer had been Paul's best friend, John Prant, one of the 2 men who had been with Paul when they had tried to join Carla's party on the day she moved in. The real killer, John, had been insulted by Carla's refusal to let them inside, and so he'd come back to teach her a lesson, although he claims he had not meant to kill her. In July of 1983, John was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 75 years in prison. Despite repeated attempts to discredit the bite mark evidence on appeal, he remained behind bars for 37 and a half years until 2019, when he was freed on parole. Since then, John has engaged the help of the Exoneration Project to try to discredit the bite mark evidence and clear his name. To this day, John maintains his innocence. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to... In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became very popular amongst young people in America. Hitchhiking is a form of transportation where you basically get rides from strangers. And so the way it works is a hitchhiker will stand on the side of a busy road and they'll extend their arm out and they'll kind of hold their thumb up, which signals to passing motorists that they want to hitchhike. That's the kind of universal sign for hitchhiking. And then a willing motorist, when they see a hitchhiker, they'll pull up alongside and offer a ride. Now, today, it seems unfathomably dangerous to just hop into a stranger's car, or conversely, for a motorist to pick up a random stranger on the side of the road. But back then, this was considered totally normal and socially acceptable. And so with that in mind, on September 29th, 1978, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Vincent was standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, which is not far from San Francisco, California. Mary was a rebellious teenager who had recently run away from her home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through a very nasty divorce and she just couldn't stand to be in the house anymore, and so that's why she had run away. And so she had hitchhiked all the way up to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. But after only being there for a couple of days, she became unbelievably homesick and wanted to go back and be around her parents and her family. And so one day when her grandfather was out, she slipped out of his house and she began hitchhiking back to Las Vegas, Nevada. And so she had hitchhiked from Los Angeles to Modesto, California. That's where the first person was willing to drive her to. And so she was on that strip of highway in Modesto looking for another ride that could take her farther south. She was on this highway with 2 other young hitchhikers. They all had these signs that said going south, so they weren't just holding their thumbs out, they were holding these signs. And so the 3 of them are huddled in a group, they're holding their signs up, and at some point, mid-afternoon, this light blue passenger van that only had 1 passenger, it was the driver, he was a 50-something-year-old man, he looked pretty harmless. He pulled over when he saw their signs, and he parked on the side of the road maybe 15 feet ahead of where they were. And so Mary's companions stayed where they were, and Mary ran up to this light blue van, and she looked through the passenger side window, which had been rolled down, and she asked this guy, hey, can you give all three of us a ride? We're going south. And this man, he would look at her and say, I can only give you a ride. I can't give the other two a ride. I can only give you a ride. And so Mary is confused because she's looking at this guy and she's seeing all this space in his van, and she's thinking to herself, why am I only allowed to go when they're going the same place I'm going and there's plenty of room in this van? But when she kind of gently prodded this man and said, well, are you sure you don't mind taking them too? He just said, look, I will take you, I will not take them. And so Mary said, okay, well, hold on, let me go back and get my bag. And so he stays parked, she leaves the van, and she runs back to the other two people she was with, and, she explains the situation, and they tell her, Mary, this is not good. There's clearly something off with this guy. But Mary, even though she too shared this kind of reservation about this guy, she was so desperate to get home. She was so homesick that she couldn't face the idea of having to wait around for another ride, which might not come until the next day or the day after, because not every motorist is willing to pick up hitchhikers, and she just did not want to wait any longer. And so she told her companions that, guys, I'm going to take the ride. And so she says goodbye to her two friends, she grabs her bag, and she runs back up to the van, and she hops in the passenger seat. As soon as she sat down and closed the door, this man pulled back out onto the road and started driving, and then he turned and looked at Mary and introduced himself. His name was Lawrence Singleton, and he was 50 years old. And then Mary, she introduced herself, then they have some small talk, and very quickly, Mary feels at ease around Lawrence. He kind of reminded her of her grandfather. He was very nice, very polite. And so when she started to feel tired pretty early on in their trip, she said, hey, Lawrence, do you mind if I doze off while you drive? And Lawrence would say, no problem, go ahead, go to sleep. And so Mary turned away from Lawrence and kind of curled up on the seat, and pretty quickly she was asleep. A little while later, when she woke up, she looked out the window and immediately could tell they were going the wrong way. So she turns to Lawrence and says, we're going the wrong way. And Lawrence would say, oh, you know what? I made a mistake. I'll get us turned around. Sorry about that. I had no idea. But Mary's thinking to herself, we're really far in the wrong direction. There's no way he accidentally did this, but she kind of bit her tongue because Lawrence would actually turn around and start going in the right direction. And so they're traveling in the proper direction for a little while, and Mary's totally on edge, but she's careful not to give that off to Lawrence because she doesn't really know this guy, and even though he did make her feel comfortable, she just doesn't really know what his intentions are. And so she's just kind of looking around pretty apprehensively, and then they pull into this stretch of highway that kind of ran through this fairly forested area where very few cars were on this stretch of road, and Lawrence suddenly tells Mary that he wants to pull over because he has to go to the bathroom. He wants to relieve himself. And so Mary kind of apprehensively says, yeah, okay, that's fine. And so as Lawrence is beginning to pull off of the highway, Mary happens to look down at her feet, and she notices one of her shoes is untied. And instinctually, Mary just thought to herself, I better make sure that shoe gets tied because I might need to run away from this guy. But she didn't want to reach down and start tying her shoe. It was kind of awkward because the space was small, and she was worried it would be kind of suspicious if she did it. And so she thought, okay, as soon as we pull off, I'll get out of the car and I'll tie my shoe. And so Lawrence, he pulls over, but he doesn't just pull over onto the shoulder of this road. Instead, he pulls into this access road that kind of trails into the forest. And so as soon as he turned onto this road, the alarm bells are going off in Mary's head. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't really know what to say to Lawrence because he's not talking to her, and she doesn't really want to look at him. And so she's just kind of going over in her head what she's going to do. Is she going to run? Is she going to confront him? She doesn't know. And then eventually, after about a minute or so, when they are far enough away from the main road that no one on that road could see them, they're pretty far into this forest, Lawrence stops the car and he hops out to go relieve himself. And immediately Mary, she hops out of the car too, and she bends down to tie her shoe. Before she could finish tying her shoe, suddenly something smacked her hard in the back of the head and it knocked her unconscious. It was Lawrence. He had hid a hammer next to his seat, and when he had gotten out, he did not go relieve himself. Instead, he walked around the vehicle and smashed her in the head. When Mary came to, she realized she was laying down in the back of the van, and as she was looking out the windows, she could see that they were still parked out in the middle of the forest. And then when she tried to move, she realized her hands, her feet, everything had been tied down to the van. She couldn't move. And so as she's wondering what's going on, Lawrence comes around, he opens the back doors to this van, he hops inside, and he begins assaulting her. Mary has no idea what to do. She's a 15-year-old kid, and this guy is on top of her. He's not stopping. And so she just began quietly begging him to please stop. Set me free. I won't tell anyone. She just kept repeating that over and over and over again, and Lawrence never spoke back. He just continued the assault for hours and hours. Finally, when Lawrence got tired, he got off of Mary and he climbed out of the back of the truck, and he went around and he climbed into one of the front seats and he fell asleep. And so Mary probably tried to free herself from her restraints, but there was nothing she could do. The restraints were tied too tightly. And so for hours, she must have just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Lawrence wakes up again, and without saying a word to Mary, he just climbs out of the van and gets into the driver's seat and then drives the van out of the forest. He drives on the main road for a little while until he turns down another access road that takes them away from the main road, so away from any prying eyes. And he comes to a stop somewhere out in this forest in the middle of this big canyon. Lawrence parks the van, he climbs out, walks around to the back. He opens up the back doors where Mary is laying there whimpering and crying and begging to be set free. He climbs inside, and her torture continues for hours and hours until the sun finally came up. At which point Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the back of the van, and he's standing out there, and he turns around, so he's facing Mary, and he reaches in and he undoes her restraints. So he frees her, he pulls her out of the van and stands her up on the ground. And so she's crying, she's beaten, she's bloodied, she doesn't know what's going on, and she just gently says to him, "Please set me free." And he says, "Oh, you want to be set free? I'll set you free." And so he walks around this totally destroyed 15-year-old girl, and he reaches into the back of his van where there's this toolbox, and he pulls out a hatchet. And so he walks back and he's standing in front of Mary, and Mary would have had a fraction of a second to see what was in his hand before, in one fluid motion, he reaches and grabs her left arm with his left hand. He grabs her on the wrist, then he raises his hatchet up and he brings it down on her left forearm, severing her arm off right below the elbow. And so Mary falls backwards to the ground, and she looks down at where her left arm just was. She's in shock, and before she can do anything, Lawrence just walks over, and with his left hand again, he reaches over and grabs her right wrist. And now Mary knows what he's about to do. He's still holding this hatchet. And so she's screaming and she's kicking him as hard as she can to try to get him off of her, but his grip is too strong. And then he begins to chop at her right forearm over and over again. It would take 4 hard blows to finally sever her right arm off of her body. And so Mary falls to the ground in a heap. She's bleeding profusely. She's screaming in agonizing pain. And all Lawrence can focus on is that one of Mary's amputated hands was clutched on to his left arm. When he cut off her left hand, it had gripped onto his arm, and now it was stuck to him. And so very nonchalantly, he began trying to flick this hand off of his arm. And then finally, when it did come off, he turned and looked at Mary and realized she had gone silent, and she was limp, and she was laying in a huge pool of blood. And so Lawrence put the bloody hatchet back inside of his van, and then he just walked over to Mary and grabbed her and began dragging her. About 100 feet down the road from the van was a culvert. A culvert is a big tunnel that goes underneath roads. It allows water and runoff to pass by the road without damaging it. And so this particular culvert underneath this access road was built about 30 feet below the surface of the road. And so if you were standing on the road over the area where this culvert was, if you walked to the edge of the road on either side, there would be a 30-foot drop-off down to the opening of this culvert on either side. And so Lawrence dragged Mary all the way over to this section of the road over the culvert, and then chucked her lifeless body off the side, smashing it down onto the rocks below. And then Lawrence walked around very carefully all the way down to her body and stuffed her inside of the actual culvert. And then as he was walking away, he said to her, "Now you're free." After Lawrence left, Mary should have been dead. Really, she should have died at several points along this attack. But miraculously, Mary did not die. And in fact, she would later say she vividly remembered the entire attack. She was fully lucid, fully conscious, fully aware for the entire thing, save for the moment when she was knocked unconscious by the hammer. And so she vividly remembered having her arms amputated, and she specifically remembered one particular point in the beginning, before her left arm, the first arm, had been amputated. He grabbed her left wrist, and she in turn instinctively grabbed with her left hand onto his left arm. So she's clutching onto him, And so when he came down and cut her arm off, she began falling backwards, but she remembered thinking to herself, why am I falling backwards? I just grabbed onto his arm. I had a firm grip. And then as she's falling, it's like time is standing still. She literally saw her hand still clutching his arm and saw it had been cut off of her body. And then when Lawrence cut off her right arm, despite being in agonizing pain, it's like she instinctively understood that she has to pretend to be dead. Otherwise, she will die. And so she went totally limp, her eyes were half open, and she watched as Lawrence is flicking her left hand, the one that she thought she had gripped onto when she was falling back. She watched as he shook that hand off of his arm. And then she was limp as he grabbed her and dragged her the 100 feet to the culvert. And she was limp and still and didn't make a sound when he threw her 30 feet down onto jagged rocks, and she broke 4 of her ribs. She was in excruciating pain, but her will to survive was telling her, make no sound, take this punishment, and you will survive. And then after he left, she remembers thinking, I don't know where he is. He could be waiting up on the road for me. I can't just crawl out and try to save myself because then he might actually finish me off. And so she laid in this culvert in this horrible position, totally contorted, with her arms gone and broken ribs. And then finally, after a while, she started to feel exceptionally tired, and that was from blood loss. And she said there was a voice in her head telling her, you can't go to sleep. If you go to sleep, you're gonna die. And if you die, we can't catch this monster, and he's gonna do this to someone else. And so she had this surge of adrenaline where she decided, I'm gonna live. I'm gonna get out of here. I don't know if he's still up there, but I have to get out and I have to try to save myself. And so somehow she got out of the culvert, and then once she was on the ground, she dug the nubs of her arms into the dirt and attempted to pack the wound with dirt and mud. And then afterwards, she raised her arms up over her head because she didn't want the blood and muscles to fall out. And so with her mutilated arms up over her head, she managed to crawl up this embankment, up onto the road. She's got no clothes on. She's covered head to toe in blood. She's in shock. And she starts running down the highway. And a car would actually come by fairly quickly, but they were so startled at what they were seeing, they didn't stop and they drove on. And so Mary would ultimately run 3 miles on this highway before finally flagging down a passing motorist that happened to be a young couple. And after they got over the initial shock of what Mary actually looked like, they put her inside of their car and they sped to the hospital. Mary would stay in the hospital for a month, and during that time, she would give police all this information about her attacker, about Lawrence Singleton, and using her very detailed description of him, the police were able to come up with a very good composite sketch. And Lawrence Singleton's neighbor happened to see that sketch, and they turned him in. Lawrence was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison for what he did to Mary. It was the maximum sentence that the judge could give. The judge wanted to do more, but legally they couldn't. And so Mary, she testified at court. And so after it all ended and he was sentenced, Mary was leaving the courthouse. And as she passed by Lawrence, it was the one time she had to be physically close to him, he turned and kind of leaned into her and said, I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life. 8 years later, Lawrence was paroled for good behavior, and so of course this terrified Mary, who by now had become a wife and she had 2 sons, and so she's worried that now that this guy is free, he's going to come and finish the job. But Lawrence would not go after Mary. Instead, 10 years after he got out on parole, he would attack another woman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes, and unfortunately he would kill her. At Roxanne's murder trial, Mary would actually testify against Lawrence, and her testimony is what they used to secure a death sentence for Lawrence. But before he could be executed, Lawrence died of cancer in jail in 2001. When Mary heard that Lawrence had died, she felt very cheated. However, her sons were very relieved to find out that her attacker had died, and so she took some solace in that. Outrage over Lawrence's early release, considering what he did to Mary, and the fact that that early release led to another person being killed, led to the creation of the Lawrence Singleton Bill, which gives judges the ability to give 25-year to life sentences in cases that involve torture. Meaning, under this bill, Lawrence would never have gotten out of prison after what he did to Mary.